She was sobbing against a stranger's Bentley, and she had no idea the man walking toward her was about to change her entire life. Victoria Russell had exactly $40 to her name, a thrift store dress that had already seen better days, and a 7-year-old daughter at home who believed, with her whole heart, that tonight might finally be the night her mother met someone good. Victoria did not believe that. Not anymore. Not after 3 years of doing it all alone. She had been stood up, left waiting 4 to 5 minutes at a restaurant she couldn't afford, watching the hostess's pitying glances, until a 2-line text told her everything she needed to know about how little she mattered to the man who sent it. So she fled to the empty level of the parking garage, sat down against the nearest car, and let 3 years of exhaustion finally break her open. She had no idea the car belonged to Marcus Whitmore, billionaire, CEO, a man who, by his own admission, was married to his work and hadn't let anyone close in a decade. And she had no idea that in the next 60 seconds he was going to stop, kneel down beside her, and ask the one question no one had asked her in years. What happened? What she told him next would set off a chain of events neither of them saw coming. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why this moment in a parking garage became the night that saved them both. Marcus had a blind date in 40 minutes, one his sister Caroline had all but forced on him. He had every reason to walk past the crying stranger at his car and let security handle it. That was the old Marcus, calculated, guarded, allergic to complications. But something about the quiet, desperate way this woman was breaking down stopped him cold. She startled when she saw him, mortified, scrambling to explain she hadn't meant to trespass, that the level had been empty and she just needed a minute. And then, unprompted, it all came pouring out. She'd been stood up. She couldn't afford the parking fee. Her babysitter charged by the hour she didn't have. And her daughter, her voice cracked completely here. Her daughter had spent all week hoping that if Mommy met someone nice, they wouldn't have to move again. The second she mentioned her daughter, something shifted in Marcus. "What's her name?" he asked. "Grace," Victoria answered, and just like that, the exhaustion in her eyes softened into something fierce and tender. Marcus recognized that look. He'd seen it on his own mother's face, years earlier, back when she was working 3 jobs just to keep him fed after his father died. He did something that would have shocked anyone who knew him. He pulled out his wallet, pressed cash into her hand, enough for the parking, a car home, and extra for the babysitter, and refused to let her argue. When she asked why a stranger would do this, he told her it was payback for kindness he'd once received. It wasn't the whole truth, and he knew it. He just didn't understand the rest yet. She told him her name was Victoria Russell. When she realized exactly who she was talking to, Marcus Whitmore, the man who just bought the Henderson building downtown, she nearly refused the money outright. But exhaustion won, and she let him send her home to her daughter. As she disappeared into the elevator, Marcus stood alone in that garage with his phone buzzing. His sister, furious that he might bail on the blind date. He looked at the text. Then he looked at the empty space where Victoria had been standing, and he typed back 4 words. Something came up, rescheduling. He had no idea yet just how much was about to come up. Here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. Marcus Whitmore did not let it go. He used a license plate from her parking ticket. And by 10 o'clock that same night, he was standing outside a rundown apartment building, knocking on Victoria's door. She opened it in shock. He admitted, awkwardly, that he'd tracked her down to apologize for handing her cash and sending her off like a problem to be solved. It should have sounded unhinged. Instead, it made her laugh for the first time in what felt like months. And that laugh is when everything really started. Marcus made her an offer that sounded almost businesslike on the surface. 1 real date, no pressure, no expectations. He got to tell his relentless sister he'd actually gone out. She got to go home and tell her daughter that yes, Mommy really had met someone kind. But underneath the practical wording was something neither of them said out loud yet, that for the first time in years, they each wanted to see the other person again. Victoria set the terms. Saturday night. Somewhere normal. No pretense. He agreed, and before he left, he told her something that stayed with her long after the door closed, that watching her fight so hard for her daughter reminded him what real stakes in a person's life actually looked like, the kind no boredom could ever teach him. That night, lying in bed, Victoria got a text from an unknown number. "Sleep well, Victoria. I promise to be on time Saturday." For the first time in 3 years, she fell asleep smiling. But here's what neither of them knew yet. The biggest test of this fragile new connection wasn't going to come from the outside world. It was going to come from Victoria's past, and it was going to show up at her front door in the middle of what should have been their most romantic night. Keep watching, because it gets so much harder before it gets better. The week crawled by in a blur of nervous energy. Victoria kept expecting Marcus to disappear, to realize a man like him had no business getting tangled up with a struggling home health aide and her 7-year-old. Instead, small texts arrived every evening, simple check-ins that felt more real than anything Trevor the accountant had managed in weeks of messaging. On Thursday, Marcus called and demanded her dress size, refusing to let her argue. The next day, 3 designer dresses arrived at her door with a handwritten note. Choose whichever makes you feel most beautiful. You deserve to feel that way. When Grace saw her mother twirling in the emerald green one, she gasped, "Mommy, you look like a princess," and asked, with a devastating honesty only a 7-year-old can manage, whether this nice man might become her new daddy. Victoria's heart clenched. She told her daughter not to get her hopes up, that nice doesn't always mean forever, that sometimes things fall apart even when we want them so badly to wake. Grace, far too wise for her age, asked if this was about what her father had done. Victoria didn't have an answer for that, but Grace, undeterred, decided she was going to believe hard enough for both of them. Saturday night, Marcus arrived exactly on time, flowers in one hand, a wrap gift in the other, not for Victoria, but for Grace, a beautiful, leather-bound book of fairy tales, chosen because Victoria had once mentioned her daughter loved stories. Grace hugged it to her chest like a treasure, and then looked Marcus dead in the eye. "You're going to take good care of my mommy tonight, right? And bring her home safe." "I promise," Marcus told her solemnly. "Your mother is in very good hands." Dinner was everything the first date should have been. Marcus told her the truth about himself, that he hadn't come from money at all, that he'd grown up poor in Queens, eaten ramen for 2 years straight, slept in his office because he couldn't afford rent. "I haven't forgotten where I came from," he told her, and something between them shifted for good. He wasn't just a billionaire in a glass tower. He was someone who understood exactly what she'd survived. And then, mid-dessert, her phone rang. It was her babysitter, Mrs. Patterson, and her voice was shaking. Victoria's ex-husband, Michael, the man who had walked out on his own daughter 3 years earlier without so much as a phone call since, was standing outside her apartment door, demanding to see Grace. Marcus didn't hesitate. He paid the check and drove her home himself, and by the time they reached the building, they could hear Michael's voice already echoing through the stairwell, loud, entitled, arguing with an elderly woman who was standing her ground far better than anyone expected. What happened next in that hallway would reveal exactly who Marcus really was, and it is a moment that changes his entire story. Stay with me. Michael hadn't come because he missed his daughter. He'd come because his new life had just fallen apart. His girlfriend had left him, taken half of everything, and suddenly a daughter he'd abandoned 3 years earlier looked like a convenient place to land. When he saw Marcus standing behind Victoria, his face twisted into something ugly. He accused her of trading up, of using Grace as bait. It was cruel, and it was exactly the kind of thing he'd always been good at. Victoria didn't back down. Years of buried anger finally broke loose. She told him, flatly, that he had signed away his rights, that Grace was smart and kind and brave, and that she hadn't learned any of it from him. Marcus stepped in only once, his voice ice-cold. If Michael tried to see Grace outside of proper legal channels again, he would spend every dollar he had left fighting a restraining order. Michael left with one last bitter jab about Victoria having nothing to offer, and Marcus's expression told her exactly how wrong he thought that was. When her legs finally gave out in the hallway, it was Marcus who caught her. Kneeling beside her, he told her plainly that she had nothing to apologize for, that Michael was wrong about her, that she had more strength in her little finger than her ex-husband would ever have in his whole life. And then he said something that hung in the air between them far longer than either of them expected, that seeing her fight for her daughter reminded him exactly why he'd built his empire in the first place, to protect the people he cared about from ever feeling powerless again. He left that night without pushing for anything more. Just a text before bed. Tonight wasn't ruined. Getting to see how fiercely you protect your daughter just made me respect you more. Victoria read it 3 times before she fell asleep. What followed were 8 of the happiest weeks of Victoria's life. Marcus didn't disappear the way she kept bracing for. He showed up, to Grace's school play, cheering louder than any other parent in the audience. He helped her move into a safer apartment when Victoria's old building gave her 60 days of vacate. He took them to the aquarium on a rainy Saturday, and when Grace threw her arms around his neck and called her best grown-up friend ever, Victoria watched something in Marcus's face come completely undone. That was the exact moment she knew she loved him, but she never said it out loud, because underneath all the joy, one fear kept gnawing at her, that eventually a man like Marcus Whitmore would wake up and realize exactly what her ex-husband had said was true, that she had nothing real to offer him. She had no idea Marcus was carrying an almost identical fear of his own, one rooted in a betrayal from 10 years earlier that had shaped every wall he'd ever built. And in just a few days, that secret was about to surface, on the one night of the year Marcus dreaded most. What Victoria was about to learn would either end everything, or finally set both of them free. Don't go anywhere. It was Marcus's sister, Caroline, who finally forced the truth into the open. She called Victoria out of the blue and asked to meet, alone, at a small coffee shop across town. Victoria's stomach dropped the second she heard the tension in Caroline's voice. Over coffee, Caroline told her something Marcus had never once mentioned. 10 years earlier, he'd been engaged to a woman named Amanda, beautiful, wealthy, seemingly perfect. 3 months before the wedding, Marcus overheard her on the phone, laughing with a friend about how she'd landed the ambitious poor kid and planned to mold him into a proper society husband once the ring was on her finger. She had never loved him. She had loved what he could become. Marcus called off the wedding and buried himself in his work for a decade, convinced that anyone who got close to him only wanted his money, his status, his name. Until Victoria. You're the first person in 10 years who's made him believe he could be more than a bank account with a pulse, Caroline said, but is terrified. He won't tell you how he feels, because he's convinced you'll eventually realize you could do better. And then Caroline told her something that changed everything about the night ahead. It was the anniversary of Marcus's almost wedding. He always spiraled on this date. If Victoria didn't tell him the truth tonight, Caroline warned, he was going to pull away, not because he wanted to, but because fear always won when he was left alone with it. That evening, Marcus picked Victoria up for dinner at the same waterfront restaurant where they'd had their very first date. But something was wrong immediately. He was distant, distracted, and halfway through appetizers he finally said a word she'd been dreading, that these past 2 months had been incredible, but maybe he'd been unfair, monopolizing her time, and maybe she deserved someone without all his baggage. Victoria didn't let him finish. She told him she knew about Amanda. She told him she wasn't her. And then, with her heart hammering, she said the word she'd been too scared to say for weeks, that she hadn't fallen for his money or his name, but for the man who asked about her daughter before he even knew her own name, who read bedtime stories in funny voices, who remembered exactly how Grace liked her pancakes shaped. I love you completely, messily, terrifyingly, she told him. And if you push me away because you're scared, you're going to break both our hearts. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing at all. And then, his eyes bright with tears he didn't bother to hide, he told her he'd loved her since the very first night in that parking garage, since the second he heard how fiercely she talked about her daughter. He'd been terrified to say it, afraid he couldn't survive it if she only wanted what he could give her. But he was done letting fear make his decisions. He stood up right there in the middle of the restaurant, pulling her to her feet in front of every stranger in the room, and told her exactly what he wanted. Her, Grace, messy mornings, school plays, arguments over the dishes, forever. Will you take a chance on me? On us? Victoria didn't hesitate. Yes, absolutely, yes. They barely made it through the rest of dinner before rushing home, laughing and crying in equal measure, to find Grace still awake, curled up with her fairy tale book. Marcus knelt down to her level, suddenly more nervous than he'd been proposing to her mother, and asked if it would be okay if he spent a lot more time with them, maybe even lived with them, like a family. Grace's eyes went enormous. Like a family. Exactly like a family, Marcus told her. She launched herself into his arms without another word. I told Mommy you were a hero, she whispered into his shoulder. And heroes always stay for the happy ending, right? Right, Marcus said, his voice thick. The happiest ending. 6 months later, they stood together at a small ceremony surrounded by the people who'd watched their unlikely story unfold. Caroline, crying through the entire thing, Mrs. Patterson dabbing her eyes in the front row, and Grace, radiant in a tiny princess dress, scattering rose petals down the aisle as Flower Girl. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, a small voice rang out from the front row. Grace marched straight up to the altar. "I object," she announced to the entire room. "I just wanted to say I'm really happy Marcus is going to be my dad, because he keeps his promises, and he makes my mummy smile, and he reads bedtime stories in funny voices, and that's what dads are supposed to do. So nobody should object, because this is the best thing ever." There was not a dry eye left in the building. Later, as they danced beneath strings of lights with their daughter twirling around them, Marcus leaned in and whispered, "Best blind date that never happened." Victoria laughed, pulling him closer. "Technically, you crashed my bad one." "Lucky for both of us," he said, and kissed her as the music swelled. Because sometimes the most unexpected love stories begin in the most unlikely places. Sometimes a canceled date is just the universe clearing the way for something far better. And sometimes all it takes is one small act of kindness in an empty parking garage to change 3 lives forever. A mother who stopped believing in second chances, a little girl who never stopped believing at all, and a guarded billionaire who finally let himself be found.